You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Robin Ely, a professor of business administration at the Harvard Business School. She conducts research on race and gender relations in organizations with a focus on leadership, identity, and organizational cultural change. Examples of her past research include studies of men and masculinity on offshore oil platforms, the impact of racial diversity on retail bank performance, and how organizational narratives about gender work and family limit both men's and women's ability to thrive personally and professionally. Her work is published in many of the top academic journals. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Robin Ely. Robin, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So you do lots of work. I mean, I'd say pretty much most of your career has been done on gender issues in the workplace. And most of the things that we hear about when we think about women and whether they're able to advance, the typical narrative is that women have difficulty advancing in the workplace because they have issues with work-family conflict, right? That they're pulled toward family obligations, and because women are the ones who give birth, especially during the first year of life. They tend to be more present than in a traditional marriage than the man, and therefore they miss out on advancement. Can you maybe walk us through that line of reasoning? And then I know you a lot of your work takes issue with it.
Yeah. So we call this the work-family narrative, and it's the explanation that women aren't advancing at the rates we might have expected because of this kind of natural inclination and commitment that women have to family. And so that's one piece of it. And then the workplace, most professional jobs these days are requiring, 24/7 availability. So when you put those two things together, they just don't work. And what is kind of taken for granted is that we need to have a workplace that requires 24/7 availability for its employees, and that women are sort of naturally inclined to care for children and to care for children, over and above their ambitions to be, successful at work. And while I think it's true, most people, I mean, men and women, this is one of the things that we find over and over again. I mean, everybody prioritizes family over work. This is not something that just women. But what that means for women, generally in our culture, is that they will, they're going to need to ratchet back at work. And what it kind of means the opposite for men, because men are breadwinners. So women are the caretakers. So if they prioritize family over work, then they need to ratchet back, either, go part-time or take roles that are less demanding, which typically means roles that are less likely to advance them that far in the organization, or leave work altogether. Whereas men are breadwinners. And so to prioritize family over work really means the opposite for them, is sort of, doubling down at work and working even harder and longer. So we have all these cultural beliefs about work and about men and women. And what we're finding in our research really kind of over and over again is that these things are just not really true. Men are as stretched at work and as unhappy about work-family conflict as women are. So it's not true that women, have any more, in fact, are any more upset about this than men are. And what we also find is that this kind of 24/7 availability requirement is kind of made up in a lot of places. And I study a lot of, what would be considered extreme work. So professional service firms, law firms, consulting firms, and the narrative is, we're a client-facing, firm, and so we have to be available for the client. And anytime the client calls, we need to we need to be responsive. And what I've seen is that there are some exceptions to that. And if you look at the exceptions, they tend to be the people, in particular, partners, people who've been successful in the organization, but who are able to manage their clients. It's really about managing their clients' anxiety, I think, because the clients don't actually need to have stuff the next day. And so they're the ones who, don't kill their teams and are kind of the exception to the rule.
So the thesis that women don't advance because they take maternity leave, is that valid? Is that a correct explanation as to why we have so many more men, let's say, on the board of directors or in C-level positions?
Well, so that's a little bit complicated because, first of all, there's a ton of evidence to show that anybody who takes a work-family accommodation, going part-time or leaving the workplace for some period of years, is going to be stigmatized and is going to have difficulty advancing. So, on some level, that is true probably for a relatively high proportion of women. I would say, that being said, when we look at our own data of Harvard Business School alumni, we don't actually find that that women are hindered in their advancement as a result of taking these accommodations. So some women are getting through, and my hypothesis is that the really star women, organizations are bending over backwards to keep them. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at women who have really made it into the senior ranks, at least our data suggests that that one thing that might be happening for them is that the organization is making exceptions for them. So while kind of the simple answer to your question is, yes, probably women are getting derailed from their careers as a result of taking these accommodations, but there's a kind of whole kind of social dynamic, cultural dynamic that's underlying that isn't necessary. And so it doesn't have to be the case that women get derailed because of their family commitments. And I think that's kind of the point that we really want to make.
Have you studied the difference between men who take, let's say, paternity leave for whatever reason versus women, and what the long-term effects are?
I have not personally studied that, but I believe what the research says, and I'm sure that it's, like any of these, there's sort of mixed findings, but I think the general conclusion from that research is that men are also penalized. Mm-hmm. It's just that they don't, they don't tend to take those accommodations. That being said, I think there's some, anecdotal evidence, at least in some industries like academia, some concerns that men who take paternity leave, and I have no idea whether this is actually true, and it's, like anything, is probably partly true and partly not. But men will take paternity leave, and they don't actually take care of their children when they're on leave, and so they're sort of using the time off to, publish more papers, get ahead. Again, I have no idea if this is actually true, but this is a fear that people have. Mm-hmm. So there is kind of controversy about, whether it's. I mean, I don't think anybody really thinks there shouldn't be parental leave for fathers, but it's a little bit controversial.
So we've seen, right, an equaling out of gender at university level, right? I mean, at my university and at most universities, it started, it's relatively 50-50 of men and women coming into universities. And we likewise see that in analyst positions and positions coming out of college. A lot of those entry level and even up until mid level, you start there's some kind of gender parity. Yet when you look at the higher level, and I mentioned this earlier, when you look at boards or CEOs or C-level positions, it's still highly imbalanced. Why is it that as we get into the upper echelons, we see such an imbalance when on the lower levels, by all accounts, it tends to be pretty equal?
So I think it's probably overdetermined, but I think from my own, research, and I'm still collecting data to look at exactly how this mm-hmm. happens, but I do believe that has largely to do with the kinds of relationships that men and women have in the workplace. And I think men, it's like kind of a network, and men are just better connected in their networks than women are. Men have the kinds of relationships that they need in order to both develop and advance.
So would this be like the old boys network, cigars on the golf course?
It doesn't really look so much like that anymore.
Yeah.
But there is a way. I mean, if you look at the, whom people are connected to in their day-to-day experience, men are just much more likely to get actionable feedback, for example. People pull their punches with women. They're worried about hurting their feelings. And so they don't actually tell them the truth about how they're performing in the places, where they, need to, need some further development or where they're weak. And so they kind of get left alone. And it's very hard. Again, I mean, the industries that I tend to study are like consulting firms and law firms. And those are places, probably like most knowledge work, where in order to really learn both the rules of the road, but also how to actually be an effective professional in those settings, literally the content of the work, you need to have somebody taking care of you. You need to have somebody who's invested in your success. And we just see fewer women having those kinds of relationships. So I think that's a big factor. And then that leads to all sorts of things. Women don't have as many sponsors. So they don't have people developing them, but they also don't have people who know about them, who are going to, let them know about some opportunity that's come up, or to really, support them as possible candidates for these opportunities. So, I think that's a huge piece of the problem.
So why is that? I mean, given that if we can probably assume that in 2019, most of the managers that are grooming the level under them and that are providing coaching services and mentorship would probably say overtly and consciously that they do not intend or even discriminate based on gender. I mean, for the most part, we can probably assume most people hold it as an ideal that we should have gender equality. So why does this persist?
It's just like, unfortunately, the answer to just about everything in this, conversations about race and gender, implicit bias. I mean, that's obviously a huge piece. I mean, that covers a lot of terrain, though.
Right.
And I think that, it's little things like what I was just saying, just not getting really useful, direct, behavioral, actionable feedback. That's a big problem. Not being, then there are always the stereotypes, and again, we don't see this sort of really bearing out, but the belief that once a woman has a child, she's going to ratchet back. Now, many women do not ratchet back, and they're still not getting ahead. So, that doesn't really explain it, but the belief that they're going to ratchet back or not going to be as serious means that with people who are busy and have limited time to invest in their, the people who report to them or that they work with, they're not going to pick the people who they think are going to be leaving the workplace. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. But those are just two pieces.
Yeah, I think in one of your articles you discuss interviewing a woman who takes off it was either engagement ring or a wedding ring for interviews.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, and so women try to learn how to manage.
And so what's her idea?
Oh, her idea is that she's going to be taken much more seriously if she isn't seen as somebody who's about to get married. Somebody who's about to get married is probably going to have a kid pretty soon, and that's the kiss of death.
So for managers, what are the best practices or recommendations to deal with some of the implicit biases that impact who rises up the ranks?
So I get asked this question a lot of times. I mean, there are so many different places to intervene in this big systemic problem. And the place that I really think is going to be most effective is probably not something that an individual manager on his or her own can do. Although there are probably some lessons from what I'm going to say about what they might do. But I really think it is a problem of the culture of the organization. And it's very, very hard to change the culture of an organization. I mean, trust me, I've tried many times. And
Right.
I've written a lot of papers on failure, like what not to do, what doesn't work. We have all these ideas about how to undertake these kinds of changes. And I've worked with companies testing these ideas. And I have, repeatedly come away from these experiences, writing papers about what hasn't worked and trying to understand why. And then, going back and saying, okay, what can we do differently? So I hate to say it, but I mean, my big answer is it's super hard to address this problem. And the, I think, we know unconscious bias. We know that exists. And I think companies have really jumped on the bandwagon of unconscious bias training, which is fine. It's good. It's good to raise people's consciousness. But there's zero evidence, really, that that kind of training makes any difference at all. Part of the problem is it's because it's unconscious. And so,
Right.
people don't actually know when they're engaging in it in relation to another person, and the other person, the presumed target of this, actually doesn't know either. And so there's just all this kind of uncertainty and no capacity to talk about it.
Yeah, it seems like an impossible task for an individual,
Yeah.
right? I mean, because we all walk around with 1,000 unconscious biases. I mean, from everything from how babies react to our perceptions of babies. I mean, things are just totally neutral to things that are not neutral, like race and gender.
Yeah. But,
it feels like we have.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this stems from everything from our entire country's history to the way that we've evolved as human beings. I mean, these really macro things that have given rise to it. And then the challenge of doing that for an individual seems immense.
Yeah. And so, I think if I could probably recommend one skill for a manager to learn, it would be how to have a difficult conversation about race and gender. And that means practicing, that means being connected to people who are different from you on those dimensions. And learning how not to be afraid to have those conversations and not be afraid to make mistakes. And then on the other side, it's also, being forgiving and generous, and really being committed to having a relationship where it's all about learning and being open to that and being open to hearing what another person's experience is, which, isn't necessarily the truth of what's happening, but it's it's something important to talk about if a team is going to be effective. People are walking around with resentments and concerns and fears and feeling threatened. It's, highly problematic for their effectiveness. So I think that would be the one skill I would want people to learn.
Do you think is the modern organization, especially I'm thinking specifically of corporations, is it a masculine oriented organization? I mean, can we think of gender in terms of the way our organizations are structured? Oh,
sure. Yeah. They're gendered most organizations are gendered to some extent. And, the extreme ones, we typically think of masculine gendered occupations for one thing, and then organizations. And, these are occupations and organizations that basically conflate, requirements for success, whether it's leadership skills or,
What would that look like for a leader? Like if you're in a masculine oriented organization, how would leaders differ versus one that's more neutral?
Well, leadership would be defined in masculine terms. And so right there, it's probably easier for men to enact the kinds of behaviors that the organization recognizes as leadership because they're men. But that's not a given. But, just conflating our stereotypes of who men are: assertive, decisive, aggressive, bounded, emotionless, all those kinds of stereotypes, conflating those with what it means to be an effective leader or an effective, just fill in the blank, that. And the more that's the case, the more masculine we would say that organization or occupation is.
So for an organization that's oriented toward, let's say, taking on risk, being decisive. When women emerge in leadership positions in those types of environments, do they take on the masculine traits, or would they, or can they be more of the, just to use like gender role theory, more cooperative, more traditional female norms?
Well, I think it really depends. I mean, this is you're getting into the kind of classic double bind that so much has been written about lately, with this idea that when women enter those kinds of jobs that are defined in masculine terms, they're in a double bind, because on the one hand they kind of need to enact those traits in order to be seen as fit for the job, but they also need to be seen as sufficiently feminine, and those traits tend to run counter to the masculine ones, because we think of masculinity and femininity in a kind of zero-sum, diametrically opposed terms. So it creates a double bind for those women. And I think this is more. There's a ton of research on this that shows that women do need to make that trade-off. My observation in teaching a lot of women executives is that they have tended to either consciously or unconsciously make the trade-off in favor of enacting the more, I guess I would say, enacting the traits that are perceived to convey competence, and are, less likely to, or they're sort of given up on, trying to fit some kind of notion of what it means to be an ideal woman. And that gets them into trouble, because this is the sort of competence likability trade-off. So you might be seen as competent as a woman in those roles, but you're not seen as very likable, because you're not satisfying the the kind of requirements, the gender requirements for being a female.
Right. So we call that the backlash effect. Right. So women, I mean, I'm most familiar with this in negotiation context, where women who are succeed in negotiations and act in a competitive manner, they're viewed as being uncooperative and not unlikable.
Right.
Which then, for future negotiations, takes off one of the important levers where they feel like they need to act more cooperatively than they would otherwise behave.
Yeah, and I would say that, in the broader scheme of things, outside of these negotiation contexts, where, that's certainly been a place where this has been established pretty clearly, you get to a certain point in your career, and competence has served you very, very well. But at some point, you're going to get passed over because you're not seen as likable. And if you're not seen as a team player, nobody wants you in the C-suite.
Right.
So that's, I think that's where we see that's where I see, anyway, senior women who, for most of their careers, have been very successful and have not experienced their gender as a problem. And they're kind of like, I don't get what these women are complaining about. Like, I've been just sailing through, and I've had all this support, and it's been fantastic, and I've been able to be successful because I'm so competent, and all of that is true. But then there comes a point when they get passed over by somebody that they don't think is as competent as they are. And that is where, that's where they start to say, oh, okay, I think my gender might have something to do with this. So
that's really interesting. Turning to another topic, how has the MeToo movement impacted your thinking on some of these issues in kind of the last few years, and just some of the some of the changes that we've seen in public discourse?
It's interesting. I've never done research on sexual assault or sexual harassment. My most recent kind of, or I guess I would say, my initial foray into that topic is collecting. We started a longitudinal study of Harvard Business School alumni in 2012, and we've administered now 3 waves of surveys. The most recent one was in 2018, and we decided to focus on the MeToo, whole movement. What's the impact on you? What's been your experience of sexual assault or sexual harassment? And also asking, asking people to report whether they have ever engaged in any of this, kind of a whole list of behaviors, from fairly mild things to more egregious things. Not getting a lot of play on those. Those people are not anything to that. But we've only looked at the data very, very cursorily. So, what I can say is that we did look at this variable that called, masculinity as a contest culture. You may have heard of This is kind of a concept that's been out there. Peter Glick and Jen Berdahl developed this this measure. So we had people in the survey reporting on the culture of their organization, kind of along the lines we were just talking about. These would be like hyper masculine cultures, dog eat dog cultures, don't show any weakness, those kinds of things. And we do see that people report more experiences of sexual assault and sexual harassment in organizations where they have reported that the culture is more like a masculinity contest. And then we also see people reporting more experiences of sexual harassment in organizations where they report having fewer women in senior positions in organizations. So, this all makes sense. And, and again, it's this idea.
Of course, a lot of this is an attraction issue, right? And less, right. It's who's attracted to those organizations to begin with. The type of applicant that they receive.
Yeah. So we definitely don't have any way to, sort of figure out how much of this is the culture of the organization and how much is the people entering into a culture that kind of creates these things. But I think I feel very confident saying, well, for sure there is some selection. I do think that the culture of the organization gives permission for certain kinds of behaviors and reinforces. And, we do know that people end up in organizations engaging in behaviors that they actually are not very proud of, but they're doing it as a way to be accepted. So we know that happens. So I think
how much is the variance between the high groups and the low groups? So I'm thinking, some companies that have, much higher rates of sexual assault versus company cultures that makes it where that's less likely.
I wish I could remember. I don't know. And I would be actually a little reluctant to report the numbers because we just haven't looked at it as carefully as I would like to. I mean, the other thing that I think is interesting, you were asking, what's the impact of this Me Too movement, on organizations around issues of gender. I think it's probably been something of a double-edged sword. And this has been, people are starting to write about this and provide data on this. We should have some as well. But looking at just asking people kind of self-report, what's been the impact of this movement on your own behavior, like asking men with respect to, how they treat women. And we are seeing men reporting that they are less likely to mentor women, for example, because they're worried about being accused. And where I really want to take the analysis that we have, and I haven't been able to look at this yet for some technical reasons of putting the data sets together. But what we really want to, my hypothesis is that men who are saying that are men who were not mentoring women in the first place. And so I don't actually know how much, the narrative out there is that we need to worry about the backlash. And I think we do, but I'm not sure that we're seeing any real dip in the extent to which women are being supported as a result of it. I don't know, but that's my hypothesis.
And have you looked at all about how organizations have changed around the Me Too movement?
I haven't.
Whether that's from
I haven't. Okay. I mean, I think they're kind of at a loss for how to address the issue. I know there is some research showing that when companies have these mandatory trainings where they're, educating them about sexual harassment, there seems to be a backlash to those and increases in that kind of behavior. So I think it's a tough nut.
Yeah, I just finished Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Talking to Strangers, and it doesn't really cover the workplace issue, but it does cover. There's an entire section that is simply fascinating on consent on the college campus and with the frat parties, and it is one of the most brilliant deep dives into how complex consent is. And and gender effects, and I've actually submitted it to our first year orientation group.
Interesting.
Like, this is what we should be using. It is so deep and complex. The book's great. I mean, I think it's his best work.
Really?
And yeah, but the section on consent is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think especially on college campuses. I mean, I haven't read it. I will read it. It sounds great, and I completely agree. Just from what the conversations that we have in the you know uh, sort of interacting with our own students around this topic, it's just very clear that what it means to give consent is very gray.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it gets into the book gets into the biology of blackouts and how much all this is confounded when both parties legitimately are blacked out
Exactly.
and do not know,
Right.
have literally no recollection of what happened.
Right.
So
And
it ties in the
Yeah.
whole question of consent with alcohol intake, and it's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on another topic, so our society, we somewhat assume that women and men are fundamentally different. I think of the book, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago. The men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And so in your research and some of your writing, how much are men and women different in terms of disposition, behaviors, their attitudes? Are men and women, on the whole different, or are they more similar than we would think?
Well, this always gets me in trouble. This is such a controversial topic, which I find fascinating that it is such a controversial topic. But you look at the empirical evidence, there isn't much to support the idea that men and women are fundamentally different in any way. And when I say that, I can't tell you the pushback I get. My students can't, many of them are just like, what? That's just not true. But the fact is, if you look at the empirical evidence, there isn't really any evidence for there being, trait differences between men and women. Women are not less confident than men. Women are not worse negotiators. They're not even really more family oriented, as I was saying earlier. The manifestation of that family orientation is very culturally shaped, and so it can manifest at the kind of manifest behavioral level. It can look different, but yeah.
So I think we should try and tease out maybe some of the differences, right? So clearly on things like there are clear physical differences, height, weight,
right,
where the mean difference between men and women is going to be very high.
Right.
I mean, there's testosterone, which is going to differ on mass between men and women. So does that play out in terms of things like competitiveness within a negotiation or assertiveness? Do you see that those kind of traits differ?
In terms of what, when I looked at the meta-analyses, so it's for sure you will see individual studies that support, gender stereotypical differences in the direction, of women being less competitive than men. But if you look overall, those studies, they're just, it's a mixed bag. It depends. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on, it depends on all sorts of things. So that the results of these studies are just mixed, and across all the studies averaged together, basically, they show either no or very negligible differences.
So I think there's one of your articles where you discuss how satisfaction with work differs by gender. Was that correct, or am I missing?
Probably. I wonder if this might be the results of the study of our of HBS alumni. Women might be less satisfied with work.
Yeah. And why is that?
I imagine it's because I don't, because this is a while ago. We were doing those analyses, okay. But I think it's probably explained by the fact that they have not achieved as much in their careers as they might have wanted to or hoped they would at the start of their careers.
Because we know things like depression varies by gender, right? So I think until about retirement age, women have much higher rates of depression than men.
Oh yeah, okay. So I think I understand what you're. So it's not that we don't see differences manifest differences between men and women in lots of ways. I'm talking trait differences.
Okay.
So
explain what you mean.
Okay. So fundamental, in my constitution as a woman, I think the belief is that in a woman's constitution, her very sort of the nature of who she is biologically, in every way, she's just fundamentally different from a man. She's just going to be less competitive. She's more nurturing. She's more kind. And what I'm saying is there is no evidence for that. There's no evidence that, men are just as insecure as women are. It's just that the kind of acceptable ways for men to, it may not even be acceptable, but the ways that men learn to deal with their insecurity, it just looks different from the way women do, right? Because we have gendered expectations, and people do very often tend to conform to those. And if they don't, they get in trouble. That's the backlash. Men get in trouble too. So it's not that that we won't see these. When I'm talking about these studies, these meta-analyses, I'm talking about like just basic. These are not situated anywhere. These are just basic differences. That's what we're saying.
Gotcha. I guess I just have a couple more questions. One, are you? How do you feel about the last 20, 30, 40 years in these areas, and kind of taking that? How do you see things? Are we advancing? Are we making improvements? And any projections on where this moves in the next 10, 20 years?
That's a great question. For sure, we've things have changed. And I have to say things have gotten better. I mean, I think there's no question about that. And I've been very fascinated to see the big surge of interest on the parts of companies in the last 5 to 7 years on interest in issues of diversity, concerns about lack of diversity, in particular looking at worries about the fact that the workforce, in particular senior positions, are people of color, and women are underrepresented. So I think there's a much higher consciousness. I think you can barely pick up a newspaper or magazine today and not have there be something in there. This is very different from 10 years ago, for sure. So I think that I would say also my MBA students, 10 years ago, nobody identified as a feminist. Nobody. It was super rare. I would say, not nobody, but the few people who did so extremely sheepishly. It was not an acceptable thing. And now I think most of the women do, and many of the men do. So that's a really big difference around gender. And I think we've seen much more kind of consciousness raising and open conversation about issues of gender than we've seen about race. So for sure that conversation and advances around just issues of race, whether it's discrimination or representation, have not advanced as quickly as around gender, which essentially means, it's been better for white women. And because we're not talking about race, it really is a conversation that is about, generally speaking, about white women. So I think that's great. But I guess I worry a little bit about what companies are doing about this. I think they're looking for a quick fix. I think that there's a lot of research out there now, that documents experimentally what you can do to kind of inoculate yourself against unconscious bias, various kinds of changes in practice. And I think those are really interesting. But I don't necessarily think that those things are going to be the solution. And I think that kind of the theory of change that gets advanced around those kinds of interventions is one of, like piece by piece, little by little, we're going to, chip away at this, and it's going to all add up to a big change in culture that's going to create a context where, where everybody can thrive regardless of their identity characteristics. But I don't think that that's going to happen because these are the kind of one-off things. I don't think that they get sustained. And I think that the change needs to go much deeper. And I kind of worry that companies are not going to, they're going to kind of get tired of this diversity thing. Oh yeah, we tried that. It didn't work. It's not fixable.
Yeah.
We don't know what to do. And kind of, we're going to be in 5 or 10 years, we're going to be back almost where we were, 10 years ago.
Well, I mean, I see it as these things take generations to change.
Yeah.
Right. Our feelings about race and diversity and gender certainly don't change with the policy. Definitely not with a single company policy. Right. I mean, to see the macro changes will take, a generation dying out, a new generation coming of age.
I mean,
I'm pretty optimistic.
No, I try to be, but I do think what I'm reacting to is I think there's this. Everybody's invested in this, in solving this problem. Is just trying everything, and I think it's fantastic to see so much research out there. But I just think that at the end of the day, it's people who need to change, and people change, in the context of meaningful relationships around meaningful work, and that's where I think the interventions need to come. Because, like you said, I mean, these things are deeply embedded, and people are unconsciously wedded to the status quo. They're not only just unconsciously enacting biases, they're actually unconsciously wedded to maintaining the status quo. It's threatening for these things to change.
So I want to close on just one idea and see what you think. So I covered Lean In one of my classes, and it's very rare that I cover material that just does not land at all.
Ooh.
And like the students just did not relate to it.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, why? I just stopped in the middle of one class. I was like, because I have very active and engaged students,
Mm-hmm.
Very, very smart, motivated. And I said, why is nobody interested in this? And the women said they don't get it. Like they just don't see gender as a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't see it as anything that's impacted them. I mean, these are bright, 20, 21-year-olds. And I was just really surprised that they just didn't see it. They didn't buy into the book. They didn't see that for them in their lives that it had really mattered that they were women. And I was actually very surprised.
Well, I hate to say it, but Sheryl Sandberg would have been one of them when she was that age. No,
Yeah.
I think this is, unfortunately, most of them will change their minds when they've been out in the working world for about 5 years. I mean, I used to see this in my MBAs for many, many years. They were like, and I've been doing research on race and gender for 30 years. And when I started teaching, I was at the Kennedy School, at the School of Public Policy. Students were much more on top of, much more with a raised consciousness around these issues. But when I got to Harvard Business School, it was like nobody wanted to talk about it. Everything was fine. And 5 years later, they're coming back and saying, "Oh, now I kind of see what you're talking about." And now my students are not there. Now students are really seeing, I think, the reality of what they either have come from or are about to go into. So I would give your students about 5 years.
All right. Yeah, we'll see. It was really interesting. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. Really, this has been amazing. I think you and I could talk all day about this.
Yep. Okay. Well, great. Thanks for having me. It was great to meet you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.